reading Third World Filmmaking in the West by Roy Armis, 1987. Introduction. If it is true that no production of knowledge in the human sciences can ever ignore or disclaim its author's involvement as a human being in his own circumstances, then it must be true that for a European or American studying the Orient, there can be no disclaiming the main circumstances of his actuality. That he comes up against the Orient as a European or American first, as an individual second. Edward W. Said. This study of third world filmmaking and the West has to confront a number of obvious hazards. One, firstly, it is a study of third world filmmaking written from a Western standpoint, with all the implicit assumptions that this carries. As the notes and bibliography indicate, I have tried wherever possible to draw on and refer to the work of third world theorists and critics in defining the ways in which third world filmmaking is best approached, but the overall conceptual framework is my own. Inevitably, this book cannot be offered as any kind of, quote, definitive study, end quote. It is rather a voyage of discovery through areas of world cinema that remain largely unknown, and it will have succeeded if it allows the reader to experience some of the excitement that went into its writing. 2. A work that ventures into areas as diverse as culture and politics, economics and ideology, literature and film must of necessity be a work of synthesis. My debt to the authors on whom I have drawn is self-evident, but I hope and believe that fresh illumination will arise from bringing together strands of analysis hitherto unrelated. The major problem in drawing on this contextual material has been to avoid too gross an oversimplification of arguments developed by their authors through successive books and articles over a period of years. 3. While the breadth of the issues to be confronted if third world cinema is to be put into context presents one level of problem, another and hardly less daunting difficulty is posed by the historical span demanded for such a work. Film reached the major cities of Asia, Latin America, and North America within a matter of months of the first film showings in Paris, London, and New York. So the history of film exhibition and, to some extent, film production is virtually as long in the non-Western world as in the West. The pattern of Western dominance, first by France and then by the United States, was established before the Soviet Revolution of 1917. And this pattern causes problems with the definition of third world filmmaking. Clearly, there was a considerable amount of film production in the non-Western world before the concept of the third world came into being. 4. If the concept of a third world grouping may be thought to begin, in political terms, with the 1955 Bandung Conference, this meeting of, quote, non-aligned, end quote, countries does not offer a basis for selecting countries or film industries to be treated here. Political criteria need to be reinforced by economic definitions, and basically this present study may be said to cover the development of cinema in those countries of Asia, Africa, and Latin America that A, experienced colonization in the 19th and or 20th centuries, and B, have not subsequently chosen a specialist path of development that effectively takes them away from the tight economic system that binds the bulk of these countries to the West. 5. But even this definition begs almost as many questions as it answers. Japan can be safely left aside, since it follows a well-documented alternative pattern of industrial development and hence displays a distinctive approach in its film industry and modes of cinematic representation. But what is to be done with China? Is Turkey to be excluded since it was never colonized and is a member of NATO? How are the various forms of African socialism to be regarded? Can we ignore Cuba, which has had so potent an influence on the filmmakers of Latin America and elsewhere? Question mark. Even if we shelve these fairly fruitless problems of categorization on the grounds that pre 1949 China is best understood in the context of Western colonial dominance, that Turkey has problems of economic underdevelopment similar to those of its neighbors in the Middle East, that African socialism has not resulted in economic independence, or that Cuban culture can be fully understood only if the influence of proximity and historical links with the United States is taken into account. There are still problems. A broad definition remains dangerous since it can be taken as implying that it is possible to offer generalizations about the third world that are equally valid for countries as diverse in history, culture, and resources as Mali and Brazil, or Bolivia and India. In specific film terms, it could likewise imply an equation of Ouagadougou, arguably the center of Black African filmmaking, with Bombay, the undisputed capital of the Indian film industry. 6. Moreover, though an economic definition of the third world in terms of countries that have been marked by underdevelopment stemming from the dominance of colonial or neocolonial powers offers a reasonable, perhaps the only possible starting point, there are further complications when one considers specific developments in cinema. Here, the dominance of the United States has reached unparalleled dimensions. Tony, Gar- Tony Garnett's dictum that, quote, to work in the British film industry is to know what it is to be colonized, end quote, is well known, and in many ways, the struggles of film production in Australia and Canada, which can hardly be considered as belonging to the third world, however wide we cast the net, offer some of the clearest examples of certain ideological aspects of cultural neocolonialism. 7. The problems of tackling the specific issues of film history are in many ways precisely the opposite of those related to research in the contextual issues of economics and national development. Instead of an overabundant literature couched in specialist terms, there is a paucity of available source material in English. Though this material has increased immeasurably even during the period in which this book has been reached and written, and there remain numerous gaps even when sources in French or Spanish are drawn upon. Moreover, these gaps are not simply in our knowledge of the development of third world filmmaking, but include aspects of cinema in the West as well. There is, for example, no adequate account of the economic organization and rise to world dominance of Hollywood, though various articles published since the late 1970s do offer clues as to the pattern such an account might take. Because of this lack of pre existing studies, I have been forced on occasion, as in the account of Hollywood's world role, to make assertions and generalizations that themselves really need justification at book length. Given these practical and conceptual problems and the enormously wide scope of the project, how can the approach adopted here be characterized? Question mark. Basically, I have attempted in this study to keep the focus broad and to make the issues clear, while outlining in overall development and presenting certain areas of significant achievement. The movement through the successive chapters from context to history and onto the achievements of specific filmmakers gives a progression from generality to detail, from theory to realized practice, and, let it be said, from problematics to often dazzling resolution. For though the theoretical issues raised here are extremely complex and the history of third world filmmaking is one of constant struggle against overwhelming odds, the actual achievements of the filmmakers have been strikingly original and effective. And I was reading the introduction to Third World Filmmaking and the West by Roy Armis, 1987.